Hello and welcome back to our Nation's Voice interview series. I'm Charlotte Allison, the editor-in-chief, and we are thrilled to interview Bob Rae today.
Hello, I'm Jerrie He, and I'm delighted to introduce this incredible guest speaker. Bob Rae is a distinguished politician and diplomat, currently serving as a Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. His experience in politics is diverse and very impressive, including serving as the 21st Premier of Ontario and the leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party.
He has also done incredible work in supporting displaced people, human rights, and ethnic minorities. On top of all of this, he is also an excellent alumnus from our sister campus rival, Allison.
Starting at the beginning, having grown up in a diplomatic family, much like many students at Allison, how did your upbringing shape your worldview and influence your approach to your work?
Well, I think it was really coming to Geneva that had the big impact on me because, I mean, I was a teenager at the time, and it was a very long time ago. So I'm really, really old. Just treat me kindly, gently. I could break easily. No, seriously, it really had an impact on me because being in a school where people are from all over, you really have to learn how to see the world in a different way. You can't just see it as an American or a Canadian or wherever you're from. You very quickly have to mix in. And I think it's something about the atmosphere, the environment, the vibe, the culture of the school, which is really trying to encourage people to talk about the world's problems, but also, to come to terms with, growing up and what that's all about. I mean, our teachers were really terrific. I'm so glad I was able to say, hello to some of them last June when I spoke at the 100th anniversary, which was a great moment for me to be able to come back to the school. I've been back a few times. Whenever I come to Geneva, I try to connect. Unfortunately, I go to the other campus because that's the one that I knew best, but now I'm here. I will consider this to be part of my visits and home too. I think it was really, just that sort of feeling of the world is our oyster, right? I mean, we don't see it. It's very difficult to go back from an Écolante experience and see the world only from the point of view of your own country. You really do have to figure out how to listen to the other side. And I think that's something I can remember. When I was in school in the 60s, we were there just before the Six-Day War broke out in Palestine, Israel-Palestine. And so that was a big issue. That issue was a big one. And in our Student United Nations, that was a very big experience for me. SUN was a very important part. Debate Club was a very important part of what I used to do. And I can remember that our teachers taught us to, and shared with very much this perspective that we don't avoid politics, we don't avoid the differences, we don't avoid the controversies, the things that are happening, but we also have to learn how to do it, how to actually engage, how to listen to the other side, how to have a civil discourse, and how to learn how to deal with things in that way. And that had a big impact on me. And I'm not just being sentimental. It had a big effect on me. And I think Arlene, as when I came to Geneva, I didn't know how to ski. I didn't know how to learn French, and I didn't know a lot about international things. I'd lived in Canada and the States. Those were the two countries that had really been my home. And although my dad was a diplomat, and obviously his work kind of affected what I did. This is the place that really gave me my start, if you like, in really learning how things work.
Thank you. And after graduating from Écolante, you went on to a number of impressive jobs. And throughout your career, you have been a strong advocate for Indigenous rights and for ethnic minorities, including the Rohingya people, further demonstrated through your role as chief negotiator for the 9 First Nations of the Matawa Tribal Council. What inspired...
Well, you've done your homework.
Well, yeah, we have.
Amazing.
The nation's voice. What inspired your commitment to these issues? And what can governments do to strengthen inclusivity in policymaking and support the most vulnerable?
Well, I mean, I think partly, to be honest, I think partly Ecolant. I think, well, even before Ecolant, because I went to school in Washington for 6 years, and it was the beginning of, well, obviously the beginning of my sort of awakening, if you like, but it was also the beginning of the integration of the school system in Washington. I went to public schools, and when I went to junior high school, it was an integrated school, and that was the time of the civil rights movement in the United States in the 50s. And the Freedom Riders and Martin Luther King and all of that was happening all around us all the time. And I think that made me aware of the fact that there were a lot of people living with me and who were in my classes who were not as privileged as I was, and who had experiences of racism and experiences that were very hard and very harsh, and we knew that and we saw it. And when I came here, it was like the world expanded and exploded even more. So getting to understand the experience of different people. We had children of families who had been killed in the war. We had in the Second World War, because it was only 20 years before we went to school, so that was sort of a reality. We had a lot of speakers at the school who came in and talked about their experiences and their efforts and their fights and the issues that they had in their lives. That was very important. When I went back to Canada to go to university, I had a summer job working the second year in the far, far north of Quebec, in a community that was basically an indigenous community, an isolated community. It was an Inuit community. Those days we called the Inuit people Eskimos, but the Inuit people living in northern Quebec, and a generation before them, they had lived on the land. They lived in even in the wintertime, they lived in igloos, and they lived in tents in the wintertime, and they traveled, families, groups would travel together, and they would be following the hunt and following the land. And when I first heard about this and people telling me what their lives had been like, and they were brought together to live in this one community because basically the government said, we can't deal with this any longer. We have to have you here and going to school, and we have our obligation. And this was a real culture shock for those communities, and it led to a lot of social issues that even then I could see very clearly. And so I think that's really when I started thinking and writing and studying about Indigenous communities. And I mean, what is it that makes us care about other people? I don't know. It's our humanity, right? It's just that we're human beings, and we feel sympathy, we feel empathy, we connect with people. And when we're at our best, we're really fully aware of what everybody is going through. And my father had a saying, which he used to say to me all the time, because I was, as a kid, and like now, I talk a lot, was very self-confident, was very much, sort of on top of it, looked as if I was on top of everything. And I remember him saying to me once, he said, you have to slow down. And he looked at me and he said, everybody you meet in life is facing a struggle. Everybody. You don't know what it is, and they're not always going to tell you what it is. But you have to know that. You have to know that. And I must say that has really stuck with me ever since then. And I think it's given me a certain sense of obligations towards people who have less than I have, and how do we respond to that, to those people in that situation. And so, that's affected me very much. And it's also allowed me, I think, to connect with people who are different than I am, and to try to share a little bit of my own. The other thing is, I went through a period in my life when I was really in bad shape. I don't just mean physically, I'm still in bad shape physically, but mentally and emotionally. And I had a couple of years when I was just not myself. I was just not, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know who I was really, how to behave, what to do. And I went through a real sort of messy period. And that changed me to this extent is it made the words that my father had taught me made me realize that he was right and that I was the one having the struggle. And so I think if we don't understand that the people that we meet in life around us are having struggles, then and if we can't share our own struggles, then we can't really connect with people. So you have to have that sense of it's not just sympathy, it's also empathy, because empathy is about understanding what other people are experiencing, and also it's a quality that allows you to explain to them what you're experiencing. And when you can start to do that, then you have a conversation, and then you have a dialogue, and then you have a meaningful experience. And I think that's something that I've tried to learn.
Do you think it's critical for governments to have these discussions with the people affected in order to...
Very much so. And in fact, I mean, when you're talking about Indigenous people, we're talking in North America, and in the Americas, we're talking about people who feel the land has been taken from them. They feel that they had a way of life for thousands of years, and it was their land. And they feel that land has been taken from them. And a way of life has been taken from them. Their language has been taken from them. Their religion has been taken from them. And again, coming to the UN, you realize there are many, many people who have that experience. People who have been colonized feel that their lives have been taken away by other people, and that the colonizers don't feel it. In Canada, we call it the issue around settlement and settlers. So it's a very, very big part of the world today. And it's certainly something I feel very much at the UN, that coming from a country like Canada, you need to show and understand what it is that other people are experiencing.
Yeah. And coherent with your support of minorities, you're also a founding member of the Forum of Federations in 1997. How do you believe the organization can support some national governments in navigating constitutional complexities and foster regional collaboration?
Well, federalism is really an idea of governance that starts with two fundamental principles. The form that federation can take in different countries is going to be different. There's no one model. It's not like the American Constitution, which is the federal constitution, or the Canadian Constitution, which is federal. Federalism is about two things. One is it's about recognizing difference, and the fact that people are different. It seems so simple. But in Canada's case, we have 25% of our population are French-speaking. So we had to come to terms as a country with either we're going to try to obliterate those people or just make them like the English who had won the war in 1763, or we're going to treat them as a people and say you're a people, so you can have your own religion, you can have your own setup, you can do what you want to do. But that's one thing. But the other thing is it's about what we call the dignity of difference, the fact that in recognizing the other people, you're recognizing their fundamental dignity and their ability to be themselves and to have their own identity and to respect their identity. So it's about dignity, it's about respect, it's about difference. But then what do you do if you're sharing the same land, or you're living next door, or you've got to find a way to cooperate? So federalism is then about devolving power, but it's also sharing power, and it's about bringing the power together at the center in some fashion. So federalism is about falling apart, and it's about coming together at the same time. And that's the genius of federalism. Switzerland's a federation. Every canton has its own autonomy. Different parts of Switzerland have, if we were having this conversation in Zurich, we'd be speaking German. That's the great thing about a country that has that sensibility. So I think that federal countries really start from the premise that we understand what respect is about, we understand what difference is about, and we respect that. We also know that having a way of resolving disputes and having a way of, which is what a constitution is. A constitution is just a way of institutionalizing differences of opinion, and then figuring out how do we do things together. So that, I think, is so I was asked to sort of help set up this organization, and I really enjoyed doing it, and I'm still a sort of a part of it. Hey, how are you? Nice to see you, Conrad. You're late for class, Conrad. That's good. Good. Nice to be here.
Yeah.
It's always
proud to have
it's always a privilege.
Bob Rae is one of our.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. You know who this man is? Yeah.
We do.
Keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you, Conrad. I will. Thanks. Good to see you. Thanks for dropping in.
2 guest appearances.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Should we move on?
Move on. Yeah.
Okay. I'm really interested to hear your perspective on this. Simply
You mean you
put-
weren't interested in the other questions? Or?
No. That's the only question.
okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, this is.
How do you feel about the political state of the world at the moment?
It's pretty crappy, I would say. I mean, it's really pretty bad. I think the problem is we're sort of losing we're losing our way in a way, because we're letting power politics and the pursuit of power and the pursuit of self-interest get in the way of finding the common interest. And we do this as individuals, when we lose our way, when we become too selfish, when we just try to pursue our own advantages to our own benefit and not to the benefit of anyone else. And the definition of relationships is understanding that other people have rights too, and other people have interests and feelings. And so when somebody says, I'm doing this for myself, we're doing this because we're better than anybody else, it's a bit of a horrible thing to have this kind of be the one conversation that ends up dominating the room and everything else. So I think we're seeing that in many different ways, and I think we're seeing a failure to really understand what other people are experiencing in this very big world of ours, and with so many billions of people living. And we're not taking sufficient account of the future, and we're not paying attention to the interest of future generations. So future generations will have a world that's more polluted, and that, it's warmer, and that's where weather is worse. And you say, this is crazy. We should be trying to clean up our own act in this generation so we can pass it on to the future generation. I just don't see enough care being taken for the good of the world, and I think that's really wrong. And so it's really too bad. So that's what I feel quite strongly. And here we are in Geneva, where 100 years ago we came together at the end of the First World War. And it's a little hard when you haven't read the history of the First World War, but when you really read, as you will, and experience what it meant, and it was a world war. It affected many, many different parts of the world, including Africa and Asia and many different parts of the world. The destruction was incredible, but particularly the destruction in Europe. I mean, you don't have to go very far from here into France to visit places where, for 4 years, people killed each other. In one trench to the other trench, they were doing everything they could to destroy each other. And we came out of that experience saying, God, that was awful. We have to stop doing this. We can't do this anymore. That was horrendous. Because it had been 100 years before that of relative peace and stability. And then, through the years, 25 years between 1919 and the Second World War, we did the same thing again. Only this time it ended in an even greater calamity, the 2 nuclear bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you just think, so that when we came together and said, boy, we cannot allow this to happen. We really have to find a way out of this. And we created the UN, and that we haven't learned enough lessons. And I think that's really the long and short of it. We just have not learned the lessons that we should be learning all the time about how to live together, how to take care of one another. It's not very complicated when you think about it, but we're way, way far away from doing it at the moment, and it's not good.
Thank you. Oh,
We should just wait until it's
do we?
until it's closed, and we can cut it.
That was interesting.
It automatically opens the windows.
Oh, I see. Okay, good.
Thank you so much for your insight. So would you suggest that there's an increasing disconnection between the politics nowadays and the interest of citizens? And if so, as you've mentioned in your book, What's Happened to Politics, how do you think we can bridge this gap and foster meaningful connection between political leaders and the public?
I think a lot of things. I mean, it's a good book, by the way. Everyone should buy. Everyone should buy a copy. No, seriously. I think what I was trying to say in that book was, there's a lot of things happening in our lives which are disrupting our ability to connect with one another. The main one we think about is social media. Social media is very disruptive, and when you think about it, books. When you read books. You are slowly gathering information that's coming into you at your own pace. You're kind of following it, and it makes for a more considered view. And you're going into, if you're reading a fiction book, you're reading a story that takes you out of yourself and takes you into another world. And if you read the whole book, it takes a few days. Doesn't happen overnight. And you really are entering into a world where you can play with it. You can play with the imagination of it. You can understand it better. You can go back and read it again. You can think it through carefully. But communication now is so instant, and it's this difference between thinking about things consequentially, thinking about what's the consequence of my action, as opposed to the social media, which is by its very nature impulsive. I'm going to send that message, not really knowing what the impact of it's going to be, and it therefore social media is, because we haven't really learned how to deal with it. We don't really understand it because we're in the middle of this revolution. We really haven't got a grasp on its tendency to make people have attention deficit disorder, that people don't pay attention, and people are not thinking consequentially and considerately about others, and they're not even all there when you're there. I'm here. I'm not on my phone. I'm talking to you. You don't have your phone with you, thank goodness. So you are listening to what I have to say. But you know perfectly well that once you get that little machine in front of you and you're playing some stupid game or other, you know that you're not paying attention to what's going on around you, and you're missing the point of the conversation. And one of the most valuable things in life is having relationships and being able to see people as having a value in themselves, as opposed to how can I use this person for my own purposes. And there's just all kinds of ways in which social media screws us up. I mean, it really does screw up your head. And I speak personally because I think there are times when you get overtaken by it, you get wrapped up in it, and you think it's real, and you just have to put it down and say, this really isn't real. Now, there's huge advantages to it. I have not just one, but I have two computers in my pocket, and you've got yours there, and you're able to, and you can look and find things much more quickly than we could. There's all kinds of advantages to the world. I'm not suggesting we abandon, what's there and go back to some other age, but we really, really, really have yet to fully understand its impact. And the main way in which it screws us up is in our relationships to each other, in our relationship to paying attention, and to being what I call consequential in our behavior, thinking through what we do and what are the decisions that we make that can't just be impulsive. And we all know that when we act impulsively, it's usually stupid. So we need to sort of understand that.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier that dialogue and empathy are crucial to addressing global issues. Based on this, how do you believe we can sustain such requirements in today's landscape with the rise of polarization, closed-mindedness, radicalization?
Well, I mean, look, I mean, the world is a bewildering place. It always has been, and it always is, and it always will be. It's never going to be easy because there are there's so many people living in the world, so many different languages and values and interests and technologies that are playing a part. So many, I mean, growing up is difficult enough, and living your life is hard enough without having all these added factors, coming to play. But I mean, if people can't get work, they will blame somebody who's not allowing them to work. If they can't get by economically in the world, that creates all sorts of basis for all kinds of conflicts and misunderstandings. It used to be, I mean, think of the history of Geneva, which you're all very familiar with. Escalade, we all celebrate Escalade. Well, they poured boiling oil and soup on, Protestants poured boiling oil and soup on Catholics, and they pushed the ladders away, and we all celebrate. Isn't that great? We poured, we killed all these people and maimed them, and that was great. That was a great one. And we do a lot of that in life. We celebrate our victories that are often, kind of narrow, little ethnic or religious victories of one kind and another. So I just think we have to learn how to talk about the situation that we're in, to develop a better understanding of that world, and then figure out how to fix it and how to make it better. But I do know for one thing for sure, and that is that there are a lot of people out there who don't want to fix it because they think it works for them. And so that's what makes for politics. And I mean, I spent my life in politics, so I spent my life trying to persuade people that they should think about others and figure out a way to help other people out, and sometimes it succeeded and other times it didn't. So it's part of what you do.
And speaking of politics and the international order, you have often raised thought-provoking questions before, such as whether we are simply a world of competing nations or one driven by moral obligations. Has the current state of international relations changed your perspective, such as one seen in the US, America First and Drill Baby Drill? And could you expand on your vision for a more equitable and secure global community?
Well, I think going back, I mean, and this really, I'm thinking about when I started thinking about this was really when I began studying in high school the history of the 20th century with my history teacher, who was a man named Michael Knight, who just died a couple of years ago. And Michael was a wonderful teacher, and he really took us through what happened, the Age of Empire and how that happened, and the damage that did, and what that meant for many of the countries and many of the people in the room, and sort of getting people to talk about their own experiences as growing up in either as imperializing or colonizing countries or countries that had been colonized. We try to get all that on the table. And then looking at the war and the impact of the First World War, and then looking at the League of Nations and how that tried to work and do jobs. And actually, there were people around the school, some of the really, there were sort of figures in the school that we knew that because they visited a lot and they were retired teachers. And they remembered the beginning of the school. They remembered it was 30 years before they'd been involved in what the school was like, and it had a real impact on all of us in thinking about what that meant. So, yeah, the basic. There's a French philosopher named Pascal who wrote about in the 16th century, and he said something very simple. He said he had pensées. You know the pensées of Pascal? Some of you may be studying, at some point studied them in high school. And one of Pascal's pensées was, unless justice has the power of enforcement, it's only an ideal, it's not a reality. It's just an expression of hope. But if power isn't attached to justice, it very quickly becomes tyranny. And that's that's still the world we're in. We talk about, I thought this was only 3 times a day. International law, we talk about international law. International law, I mean, think for example, why do you obey speed limits? Well, you think you might get caught, and you know the law can be enforced. Now, I don't think any of you are driving yet, but when you start driving, you very quickly think, oh, this is fun, and then you realize, it's a very consequential act that I'm doing here. A lot of things can go wrong when you're driving a car. So you have to think about the fact that the reason we have all these laws is not to make our lives more difficult. We make people wear seatbelts because we don't want people to get killed. And we want to save as many lives as possible. And it's been proven that that works. So that's what we do it for. And that's why we insist on it. But the reason we obey those laws is because we know they're going to be enforced. Vladimir Putin didn't think that if he invaded another country, which is against the law, right? It's against the Charter of the United Nations. It's against international law. A law of aggression, an act of aggression is against the law. It's against the law. It's illegal. But he can just go, who cares? Because you can't enforce the law. Or we'll take our chances that you will or you won't. We'll make a calculated risk. We'll decide whether we're going to do it or not. And that is something that we have to understand is a central weakness. I mean, what President Trump is doing, I'm being very outspoken here. I don't expect you to tweet it all out, but even if you did, I would say, fine, yes, I said that. I believe very strongly that most of what President Trump is doing is actually illegal. He has a treaty, you have a treaty with another person. You sign a deal, you two sign a deal together. You agree to do or not to do something. That's a binding agreement between you. You have a contract, and you've made a deal that you're going to do this thing, whatever it is. If you buy and sell something, if you buy something and sell something, it's a contract. You've made a deal. And if somebody breaks the deal, then they've committed, that's illegal. They've broken the law. But if you can't enforce the law, then you've got a problem. And that's the core of our problem in the world today. There are lots of lawbreakers out there in many different parts of the world, but they don't get caught. And if they get caught, the law doesn't get enforced. And that's what makes it problematic. That's what breaks the trust between people and the UN. That's what people say, what good does the UN do? UN can't do that. UN can't enforce the law. And that's a problem. But it's been the problem for a long time. It is the problem.
How much time do you have left?
Maybe one more question. We'll leave it up to
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. To conclude, what advice would you offer to today's activists seeking to translate their protest efforts into tangible political influence?
I guess what I would say is 2 things. One is persistence, and the other one is patience. And they're not contradictory. Persistence because change does not happen overnight. It doesn't. People don't change their minds overnight. People don't change their minds quickly. It takes time to get things done. You've got to keep working at it. You've got to keep at it. And I think when I was younger, I was impatient, and I thought we could get a law changed and that would change everything. We could do these things very, very quickly. You see an injustice and you say, we have to solve this injustice. And you say, yeah, but the reality is that injustice has been there for a long time. So how we deal with it is going to take a lot of work and time and effort. And it's not a short-term thing. It takes time. So it requires this combination of persistence and patience. But I would make this point that I think is equally important, and that is, for heaven's sake, don't give up. You cannot give up. You can't quit. You have to, when you see something that is wrong, you have to try to fix it. And you really, this is a moral obligation. Sometimes it's a legal obligation. It's a moral obligation, but it's a really important part of life. You will face setbacks. You will fail. You will not succeed. And then you have to figure out, well, now I've failed. What do I do? And I found the most important lesson in life that I've learned is I will fail. But I will not let that failure define who I am. I know I will fail, but I keep going. And I think that's about the best advice I can give anybody. Just don't give up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. John, thank you.
Right, so we've got about, just about 10 minutes. Now, we've been very fortunate. Last week we had Romeo Dallaire.
Oh, he's great.
Came to the school.
Great man.
This week we've got Bob Rae. There's a rumour going around that Mark Carney's coming next week. I'll clarify that, I'll confirm it afterwards. Anyway, right, so we've got some time for questions. So who would like to get us started with a question? Maybe one of the, yes.
I had a question about like right now in the world. Obviously, you being Canadian, how do you see now between like what's going on with the U.S. and Canada? How do you see Canada moving like closer to Europe? Do you see that happening in the future?
I mean, I think we are facing a very difficult moment in our life as a country, because President Trump has decided to pick a fight, to put it in its simplest terms. And we have felt for a long time that we had, when it comes to the economy and how we produce things and trade things, that we would always have a market in the United States, and in Mexico we'd have shared understanding as to how we would do our business together as three countries. And basically President Trump has said, no, that's over. And now that's what he says. So we have to say, well, now what does that mean as we go forward? Because there are many Americans who don't agree with President Trump, and there are many economic actors, many businesses and others who will say, well, we thought so too, and we'd like to convince them. Then we'll see. Today, after the tariff announcement last night, today we're going to see how the world responds, how countries respond, but also how markets respond. Because one of the things about economics, as you learn, is that governments aren't in control of everything. It's what markets do matters as well. What businesses do, what other actors in the system do. So I think one of the things that Canadians are having to come to grips with is we have been told basically that the deal we thought we had, we don't have anymore. And the way the president has told us this is offensive and hard to take. And he's also imposed tariffs on us, which are very expensive and will put a lot of people out of work, because companies won't be able to get return on the cost of what they're making. So they'll have to shut down. And we're going through that now, and it's very, very painful. It's very difficult. I do think it means we're going to have to look to other markets and other potential relationships and try to build on those. But you can't put a rope around a country and tie it to a boat and say we're going to pull over to Europe so we'll be closer to Europe. I mean, we do have this geography that we share with the United States. We have built up a relationship over a very long period of time. So it's not something you can just snap your fingers and say, oh, well, we want to be closer to Europe, and we want to be closer to China, and we want to be closer to India and Asia markets and so on. But the thing we're learning in today's world is we have to be able to manage our relationships with all the countries in the world, and we have to be able to trade with everybody. And we must not make the mistake of becoming too dependent on one market. And that's a mistake that we obviously made in good faith, and we made the mistake because we thought that other country was good to do business with us, and there was no reason for that to end. And frankly, there still is no reason for it to end, except President Trump wants it to end. I think what he's doing is nuts, but he wants to do it. We'll see how long it takes. You may have heard me talk about people who think impulsively and people who think consequentially. Mr. Trump thinks impulsively. We'll see what the consequences are, and we'll all have to deal with those.
Anna? You said earlier when you were answering fully be enforced, but it's my understanding that the reason that international law can't be enforced is to avoid tyranny. But do you think that there should be more ways to enforce international laws?
Absolutely. I don't think it's inherent in international law, in the idea of international law. I think it's a product of the fact that countries so far have been less willing than they need to be to create the institutions that will enforce the law. So that, putting it as simply as I can, it's not something that's inherent in the idea of international law. It's something that's a product of politics and the failure of countries to go to bat for the UN or go to bat for the principles that we believe in. But this enforceability problem is not just about conflict, it's also about climate change. The Paris Treaty has no provision for what happens when a country pollutes more than it's supposed to or gives out more emissions than it's supposed to. The answer to that is nothing. So if you have no consequences to the breach of an international agreement, an unenforceable treaty is interesting, but it's not as good as a treaty that can be enforced. We all talk about treaty this, treaty that. You say, well, who's going to enforce it? And there are lots of countries in the world that don't want international law to be enforced. And that's the problem that we have.
Yes. What do you see as the possible outcomes to the Russia-Ukrainian war, and how these outcomes affect the world?
Well, the hard thing to say about the war is it's still going on. It's not over. And so I don't think we know what the outcome, there are several outcomes that are possible. And there are some that are more likely than others. I think that now that President Trump has essentially decided to back President Putin and change sides, if you like, in the middle of, in the war, I think the situation is a lot more complicated and difficult from the perspective that I have, which is the war was unjust. We should be supporting Ukraine to the greatest of our ability. And we should be doing everything we can to ensure that Ukraine can fight back effectively and can force the Russians to withdraw or force the Russians to agree to certain conditions about Ukrainian sovereignty. I think that President Trump's decision to basically change sides, as I've said, I think that will make that more difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. I think whether Ukraine gets the support it needs is now up to Europe and Canada and Australia and other countries, because we can't rely on the Americans to do it anymore. And I think that willingness is being tested now. And really, in the end, there's going to have to be an agreement between Ukraine and Russia, but it's not that it's easy to find. I think the fact is the origins of the war have a great deal to do with a profound unwillingness on the part of President Putin to accept the autonomy of Ukraine and to accept the fact that it is an independent country and therefore needs to be treated with, to use the term I used before, respect. And that means respecting its sovereignty and respecting its autonomy. If Ukraine wants to join the European Union, that should be their choice. If Ukraine wants to join NATO, that should be their choice. But that's not what President Putin thinks. He thinks that Ukraine is a lot like Russia. It's been part of Russia for several hundred years, and that Ukraine can't do that. If he says no, then that's the way he wants it to be. So getting to an actual agreement is going to be difficult. I think what happens and how this war gets resolved is extremely consequential. I think it will have serious consequences for the world. Because if President Putin feels that he can get away with this, he'll be tempted to do the same thing with other countries, with other neighbors, Moldova, Georgia, even NATO countries. If he doesn't think NATO is really going to respond, then he'll say, well, let me test Poland, or let me test the Baltic countries and others. So it's very, very real, this conflict. Very real.
One final question, Allison.
Thank you. Just wondering, I was thinking about the Security Council, and I think I'm right that it's comprised of 5 countries. Is that correct?
No, it's comprised of 5 permanent members plus 10 non-permanent members who rotate every 2 years.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying. Do you think it would be beneficial if more countries were part of this?
I think the Security Council needs reform. I do think there needs to be, I think it could be helpful if it was bigger and included more countries. I think we could change the terms. I'm not in favor of giving new countries vetoes. That's my personal opinion, because the vetoes really screw things up, frankly, from my point of view. The vision that we had in 1945, that was part of the sort of the vision of the end of the war, was that those countries that had joined together to defeat Nazism and fascism had a very strong common interest, and they would work together to protect everybody else. But that didn't work out because Russia and the Soviet Union and United States and the other permanent members really fell apart. And so NATO was created, Warsaw Pact was created, all the things that happened. So it's kind of, doesn't make much sense to me to say, well, we'll need more countries need to have vetoes. That'll make the Security Council work better. I don't see that. But I do think there's a very strong aspiration on behalf of African countries, Asian countries, big countries like India, other countries who fought in the war like Japan and Germany, who say, we've been in the penalty box for long enough, we should be recognized for the size of our economies and our contribution to the world. None of this is going to happen until the political situation in the United States changes. There's no prospect that Donald Trump is going to be giving anybody else a veto or going to be adding new members to the Security Council. I just think that's totally implausible.
Okay, and with that, a big round of applause, please.
Well, thank you.